Welcome back. It feels like increasingly what I've noticed after each game of the playoffs is that people will blame the referees, they will blame the league, they will blame both. And very often I feel like it's a way of not admitting a team didn't play well. Although last night the Florida game with Edmonton, that's a new one. The team didn't try because they want to win at home. What? Can we tell that to the guys who were out there blocking shots or making saves or throwing big hits and taking big hits? I don't believe that for a moment. Do I believe that at times maybe teams take the game for granted? Yes. Do I also think that the team that's down finds that extra gear and finds a way to fight back and make it more of a series? Yes. And I think that's what we saw last night. I think Florida took their eye off the prize just a little bit. And for Edmonton, if they lost last night, their season was over. So you go out there and you empty the tank. It is something we've seen in hockey many, many times over. You don't see sweeps in a Stanley Cup final for a reason. But I wanted to look at this year's playoffs. Because the whole way through, I've heard the same thing. Well, the league's on the take. The league's working with the gambling companies so that even though for these conspiracies to work, you need like hundreds of people to be working on them. And in what I've seen over my lifetime, not that many people can keep their mouth shut. So the first round, you have the Rangers knocking out Washington in four straight. Not a whole lot to see here, right? Washington has been seen. Oh, they were a bad team. They shouldn't have been in the playoffs. Well, if they shouldn't have been in the playoffs, the other team should have got more points to knock them out. Tampa Bay loses in five against Florida. I didn't see a lot of that discussion there. Obviously, Tampa Bay, a lot of games, a lot of mileage on these players at this point. The New York Islanders losing against Carolina in five. Winnipeg losing against Colorado in five. Again, you're going to see a lot of complaints about refereeing, this and that. Oh, this is clearly a game that's, been placed in their favor because. Same with LA losing in five against Edmonton. But it's interesting because that means that more than half of the series in the first round are done in five games. One thing that I've seen people saying is, aha, that series didn't end tonight because the NHL wanted to make extra money off the ticket sales. Then why have we only seen three game sevens in the entire playoffs? This is the 15th series that will eliminate a 15th team, and there's been three game sevens. Game seven is this magical realm where anything can happen, where everybody's tuning in. In the event that the NHL wanted to maximize its returns, and if they could put the game into their favor for one team or another that they want to win it, we'd see more game sevens. And so 6 games for Vancouver to knock out the Nashville Predators. It does take 7 games for Boston to knock out Toronto and Dallas to knock out Vegas. Now, you could point out, well, Toronto, that's a big money draw against Boston, so see, that's why that series went 7. If the NHL wanted to make exorbitant amounts of money on the playoffs, the Toronto Maple Leafs would be in the Stanley Cup final, and they'd be on the verge of winning it, because every eyeball in North America would want to see if they finish it out or not, right? And for Vegas, last year, everything was apparently in their favor, and this year they lose in the first round, so these things happen. Then in the second round, Colorado lost against Dallas in 6. Carolina loses against the Rangers, also in 6. That series was almost a sweep, and then Carolina won a couple, and that's where I started seeing the NHL doesn't want these to be sweeps because they don't make as much money that way. All right, well, then why not force it to 7? Boston loses in 6 against Florida, and Vancouver loses in 7 against Edmonton. So your 3 Stanley Cup playoff series that have gone to 7, you've got Vancouver, Edmonton, Toronto and Boston, and Vegas and Dallas. But again, if the NHL was just about making a maximum amount of money, we would be talking about Toronto and Edmonton in the Stanley Cup final, because what a storyline that would be. And then in the conference final, you've got the Rangers losing against Florida in 6, and you've got Dallas losing against Edmonton in 6. And as frustrated as I was watching Dallas, at no point in time did I think, well, clearly they're not able to score and they're not getting those pucks through because they're not allowed, because the NHL won't allow it. I've never thought that. I've said this before. If I really felt like officials were on the take, the league was on the take, and there's all kinds of money changing hands, I wouldn't have a hockey channel. I would have stopped watching hockey a long time ago. I do agree that all the gambling advertising and all the sponsorship tie-ins can make things look bad. However, do I believe that there's some kind of grand scheme here? No. The reason I say no is because There's just way too many series not going to 7 games, and there's too many teams that are huge cash producers that get knocked out relatively early in the playoffs. Teams that would draw. So right now we've got the Stanley Cup final at 3-1 for Florida. Florida's going to win the Stanley Cup in all likelihood, and people say, oh, he's trying to reverse jinx. If I had powers, if I had some kind of power to influence the outcome of games, wouldn't my teams not be crap in the playoffs? Wouldn't my teams make the playoffs every year? Like, it's Vancouver's first time in the playoffs since 2020 and the second time since 2015. I don't have power. But the 2024 playoffs, again, I've just seen one sweep in 15 series. Their teams, it's really, really hard to win 4 in a row against any given team. In the regular season or the playoffs, it's very difficult to win 4 games in a row against that same team. That team will get a book on you, or again, when you're down 3-0, you have nothing to lose. You go out and you play like you have nothing to lose, and that's what we saw with the Oilers last night. Then in Game 5 at home, will the Florida Panthers refocus and look to close it out? Probably. And they have the extra day off to rest up and everything else. I mean, Florida very likely wins it in 5. That's not me trying to put my hand on anything, because honestly, it's the players that decide this. So I've never been a fan of this whole idea that there's some grand conspiracy to keep certain teams from winning, because it belittles the teams that are winning. It belittles their work. It belittles the coaching, and it just makes the whole thing kind of a farce. And I've never quite understood why people who have watched hockey for so long view it in that way, and make statements like, well, this is just as obvious as WWE. Well, even WWE people get the betting wrong. There's gambling now on wrestling. Don't ask me why. I'm not doing it, but people get that wrong too. And so that's just it. So I don't understand. So I wanted to take a look at something else, because it's something that I think we lose sight of. So we look at the last 4 teams that were standing. And since January 1st, in the regular season, the best record in the National Hockey League belonged to the Carolina Hurricanes, which is a big part of the reason why, with all the gambling, they were seen as the favorite. They went 32-10-3 from January 1st until the start of the playoffs, with a 744 points percentage. So now the discussion we could have with Carolina is, did they push so hard to do, to get that top seeding in the East, that they didn't have any gas left in the tank when they got to that second round against the Rangers? I'm not saying that's the case, but to me that makes a lot more sense than, well, just the NHL didn't want them to win it. The NHL decided they don't want them to win it. Why? And if there was some kind of obvious scheme here, owners would be up in arms. Again, coming back to the Toronto example. So you're the Toronto Maple Leafs. You can make about $11 billion every time you have a home playoff game. If the NHL was making it so you can't get out of the first round, and last year you can't get out of the second round because the NHL doesn't want that, ownership in Toronto would be screaming about the amount of money that they're losing, and then Gary Bettman would be seen as the biggest moron because you can print money with a home game in the playoffs for the Toronto Maple Leafs. No matter what people think of Toronto, the reality is people will pay exorbitant fees to watch them play in the playoffs. Sort of like for the Oilers, I saw that if this series reaches Game 6, I saw the lowest ticket price was like $1,200 for a ticket. So people will pay a ton of money in certain markets to watch playoff games. It makes no sense for the NHL to say, we'd rather not make that money on those tickets in Toronto. We're going to make sure they don't do anything in the playoffs. But usually when Toronto loses, it's Matthews' fault. So, and that's one of those things too that I don't like to get into either, because I find it weird, but people will blame a player on a team when it's a 23-man roster. There's 18 guys on a team. And I can't blame just one player. One thing I like about hockey, one of the reasons I love covering the NHL, is when one player leaves a franchise, doesn't mean that franchise is screwed. It can in the NBA. It isn't in the NHL. So, looking back, and again, so we'll take a look at this. The Oilers had the second best record. They're in the finals. Since January 1st, 31-12-5, 698 points percentage. The Florida Panthers are third. They're in the Stanley Cup final. 30-12-4 record. 696 points percentage. The Stars are fourth since January the 1st. 30-12-5 record for 691 points percentage. And fifth, the other conference finalists, the New York Rangers, who finished 30-14-3 after January 1st, 670 points percentage. So the point I'm trying to make is the teams that are still alive in these playoffs The teams that they beat in the last round were the best teams in the National Hockey League from January 1st until the start of the playoffs. They were absolutely, by their records, the best teams. So it's not really a surprise that they're the last teams left standing. And when you see that Oilers points percentage and you see their record when they'd lost 3 games in a row coming into last night's game, they're very good at winning that next game to avoid losing 4 in a row. So why wouldn't they be able to do that in the playoffs as well? This is a good team. I'm not saying they're as good as Florida. At no point in any video I've made over the last week have I said, well, the Oilers are at least as good as Florida. No. I gave Florida the edge going into the Stanley Cup final. I was like, you know what? Florida's probably going to win this. But I don't see the Oilers as a team full of scrubs. And there's reasons I can give for every single player on that roster, especially that forward group from lines 1 through 4. That fourth line was a big part of the reason why the Dallas Stars lost in that last round. That forecheck by the Oilers, that fourth line would set things up, keep the Stars pinned down. Then you roll out McDavid's line. You've got tired Dallas Stars players. Bam, puck's in the net. So they haven't been able to do that against Florida. They haven't been able to get that level of control. Florida's a better team than Dallas. That's how I see it. But it is an interesting discussion that's being had around the hockey world. I don't buy it. I can't. Because again, if I'm going to stand here and say, hey, this game was set up, the officials are on the take, the league set this up, the league made sure that this team wasn't going to win tonight, I might as well shut down the channel, because then it just means that I don't trust any of the results. Basically, I would at that point just turn it into an NHL hockey historian channel and talk about things from around the hockey world, and I wouldn't cover. But that's the thing. If I believed this, I would have believed it during the first 45 years of my life before I had a hockey channel, and I would have had a baseball channel instead. And definitely there have been arguments in every single sport, everywhere around the world, that certain results are maybe fixed or not quite 100% legitimate. The way that I've always seen it too is, it is easier to point out the flaws of officiating and of a league. It is easier to point out that, certain dark forces you can't see are against your squad than to admit they played like crap. And that was what I saw last night, was Florida just was awful. That was one of the worst performances in the Stanley Cup final I've seen, yes, since Vancouver-Boston back in 2011. That was an absolute disaster. And it can get in your head, as Kevin Bieksa pointed out when they were talking about the Oilers being down 2-0, that Boston won Game 3, and he said from that point on they doubted themselves. So those games absolutely can make a difference. Teams don't just mail it in and say, oh, forget it, we're not going to win tonight, who cares? Because you don't want to give a team oxygen in the playoffs. You don't want to give them confidence. You don't want to tell them, hey, our goalie's weakness, we just let you see it because our defense tonight didn't feel like playing. It's just, it's not something that I believe happens. Do teams sometimes let down a bit because they just assume they're going to win? Yeah. And maybe that's what happened last night with Florida. Maybe they decided, you know what, these Oilers can't skate with us, and they just didn't play very well. I find that a lot easier to sell and a lot easier for me to buy than the idea that there's some grand conspiracy against teams, because it doesn't make any sense. From a money perspective, it makes no sense. The Rangers, the Maple Leafs, the Kings are a good money generator too for the NHL. Like, there's some really good money generators that are not in the Stanley Cup final. I don't think Florida, and I mean this is no offense to Florida, but if the NHL was going to try to make the most amount of money it can off a Stanley Cup playoff, you don't have the Florida Panthers in the Stanley Cup final for back-to-back years. They're not a draw. They're not a ratings draw the way that the Rangers would be. And again, if they had their hand on, who's going to make the playoffs and who isn't, the Detroit Red Wings would have made the playoffs this year, not Washington. The Detroit Red Wings would have been a bigger draw. You've got Patrick Kane. You've got a pretty exciting team. You've got some really good young players. It would have made a heck of a lot more sense for it to be the Detroit Red Wings, just from an entertainment perspective, just from a storyline perspective. Then you have Detroit and the Rangers in the first round. You have a matchup between two original 6 teams. It just would have sold so much better, and we likely would not have seen a 4-0 lead for the New York Rangers, where they sweep that series aside. And so that's how I see it. I just wanted to make a video on that because last night's comment section, I was just like, I tapped out. I was like, I'm leaving it. I don't understand all these people saying, well, they didn't want to win tonight. They wanted to win at home. Not a thing. Nope. Never seen a player ever say, we lost the last game because we really didn't want to win. We wanted to win tonight. No. No. And if a coach believed that, I think the coach should be the first one to call them all out, and there'd be some changes in the lineup the next game. But anyways, I just wanted to talk about this. Thank you guys so much for all your support as always. And I'm going to go watch an AHL game. I'm going to review that for all you fine people on the internet as well. So thank you guys so much for all your support. If you haven't already hit like and subscribe, please do. I just wanted to give my statement on this. And there you go. Thank you guys for all your support. It's almost like the best teams during the regular season to end out the regular season are the best teams in the playoffs. It's a weird thing. But thanks again for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.